My name is Abby Sun. I'm the curator of the DocYard, and I'm here to present a Q&A with the co-directors who also edited, camera-operated, sound-recorded parts of The American Sector, our spring 2021 DocYard season opener. This film is going to be streaming on our Eventive account until 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, that's tomorrow, February 16th. Or I should correct myself, you can still purchase tickets for the screening until 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, but then you will have a separate screening window to finish watching it after that. This Q&A is being recorded and will be archived on Facebook Live immediately afterwards and on our YouTube channel by tomorrow morning. We have lots of folks to thank before we get into the meat of my introduction. First of all, Jen and Lyda, our colleagues at the Left Foundation, of which the DocYard is a program. The Brattle Theater, our presenting partners, even in a virtual form. Grasshopper Films, the distributor, for helping make this screening possible before the virtual cinema release of The American Sector. Courtney and Pacho are filmmakers with us here today, taking time out of their evenings. And most of all, to Kayla Myers, the DocYard series producer, who is doing everything on the back end for this Q&A and also for the screening itself. Thank you, Kayla. I'll also start by acknowledging that I and many of us in the audience are physically located in what is currently known as the Greater Boston area. These are the traditional and unceded lands of the Massachusetts people whose name was appropriated by this Commonwealth. As we gather here to discuss a film about the pieces of the Berlin Wall in the US and how it gets used or forgotten by those around it or turned into memorabilia, let's also recognize that the act of remembrance has often been used to justify horrific acts, like the Harvard Museum's collection of the remains of over 22,000 individuals, including what a Harvard University press release claimed was the largest collection of American Indian remains in this country. So Harvard is very, very slowly participating in repatriation efforts with Native communities due to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. We should also implicitly question Western notions of museums memorializing without regard to cultural specificity. Okay, so it sounds like we did not successfully join Facebook Live, but we're now asking people to join us here, and I suppose we will just post the recorded video to Facebook Live.
Sounds good.
So Courtney and Pacho both have had previous films screened at the DocYard. Courtney with her chilling, well, we haven't actually talked about this film, so to me it appears to be a found footage short called Mixed Signals that connects warnings of mental deterioration into nautical terms, and Pacho with a co-directed short called Mr. Yellow Sweatshirt that is a top-down single-shot look at the eponymous man in a yellow hoodie struggling to enter the Jackson Heights subway station. In addition to being filmmakers, both are also curators and writers and teachers. So they have lots to share with us on how they've conceived and executed and also distributed and screened this film over the years. So I guess I'll get started. Again, my name is Abby Sun, and I am an Asian American woman with shoulder-length black hair. I'm currently wearing a gray sweater of sorts, sort of a cardigan, and I'm in a white room with a bookshelf behind my head and a potted snake plant, I believe, behind me. So Courtney and Pacho, your film, The American Sector, is a documentary road trip, but it doesn't have very much of being on the road. And it's filmed in parts over 3 years, which you have described in interviews in the past as being a scavenger hunt, because at the time you were based on opposite coasts of the US and, you know, we're seeking piecemeal these pieces of the Berlin Wall. So I was thinking that perhaps a more accurate term for your film is a documentary geocache. I'm curious at the beginning, was the idea to go to every location? Were you hunting these pieces of the Berlin Wall down, how did you choose where to film? And did you consider, what was the significance of the locations during the production phase?
You want to take a
Let's
question?
take that.
Go for it, Courtney.
Yeah, so when we, thank you for having us, DocYard and Abby. When we started, I think our first method was to kind of compile a map, and we had a few leads. There had been some efforts to kind of compile all the different pieces before. There was a Wikipedia page, and there were some other people who had written articles. So we had a kind of working list, but it became a sort of, sort of like any insider community. Those people know where all the other ones are. So we would go to one institution and they would tip us off to others. And so it was definitely so the United States is large. And so we would create these kinds of, mini maps that were like, okay, I think we can do Nebraska, South Dakota, Kansas, and Colorado in one trip, and that would be 2,000 miles. So we were living on opposite coasts and meeting and doing these kinds of micro trips and over a pretty significant amount of time, because we both had other jobs. And so the collection process was long, and the editing process was also long. The whole, I think, essentially it was the entire Trump presidency that we worked on this film.
Yeah, I think the first shoot was at the Reagan Presidential Library the week after the November 2016 election. Geocaching's an interesting term. I feel like I almost don't even know quite enough about what geocaching actually is to say whether that's what we were doing, but I guess so, right? So it had that quality of like happening on things, and there was like such a joy when you went over a hill and saw one of these panels in the distance. We're like, oh, there it is, or we had like a sort of vague map, and it does, because it has this sort of similar visual form, that we became like real sort of connoisseurs of all the different ways that you could install one of these concrete slabs. I'm Pacho, and I have a beard, and I'm 40 years old, and I wear glasses, and I'm in front of a bookshelf.
Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot to do that. I'm Courtney. I have a bob and pink lips, and I'm in front of a stark white wall in my office. I think also, sorry, there was another question that you...
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, it was about the significance of the locations during the production phase. Like, were you, so you just explained in one answer that, one way that you were shooting things where you were grouping them by geographic proximity, like, oh, these, 3 or 4 monuments are close together and we're going to film them. But at one point in the film itself, in the American sector itself, I believe, Courtney, you say to one person, like, oh, there's a lot in Southern California, for instance. And it strikes me that the ones in Southern California, a lot of them were on private property compared to in other places. And I'm wondering if you were like specifically hunting down, like, oh, we're going to find like the one that's in the woods, or we're going to find, or were you just looking to map everything?
We were trying to be exhaustive, and the film itself only, I think there's about 45 to 50 pieces in the film, and there's a few more running over the credits, but there's a total of, I think, over 70. So we shot some that just didn't end up in the final film because they were kind of repetitive to other ones, but we tried to get to all of them. We couldn't afford to go to Hawaii, so there's one in Hawaii. That was going to be like our prize, but yeah, we never made it there. And then I think we got denied from an Air Force or an Army base. But otherwise, I think we went to almost every one. right?
Yeah, there's some sort of hedge fund in Arizona
Yeah.
that wouldn't let us in also. And of course, the CIA wouldn't let us film their piece.
Yeah, but the CIA PR person is strangely very revealing, much more so than a lot of the other people's, like the State Department official tour guide that you would have captured anyway. So, sometimes in the withholding of things, we learn a lot more about the reasoning behind it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you did just mention that the editing took a while as well as the filming. And I guess on the issue of the CIA, but then also, so the CIA, that's Black. You never filmed it. But in a lot of the other sequences, even though we may see the section of the Berlin Wall and we see the environments around it, we don't necessarily see who's talking. And to me, this is quite interesting because the film itself, just based off of the accents and the speech patterns that we hear, and the contextual clues that the people that you stumble upon give us, really seems to be a mapping also of the diversity of people who live in the US and who may encounter these monoliths. But I'm curious, what was sort of your thinking behind what voices to feature and what faces to withhold from the audience?
I'll let Pacho talk about that, but I did want to say quickly in terms of regionalism, there is I mean, it's interesting because even when you mentioned the Southern California, there's a preponderance of pieces here. I'm in LA, and that's because of Reagan and Nixon, some of their sites. It's also because of a museum here called the Vende Museum of the Cold War. But it's not sort of random. I mean, that they're peppered and scattered throughout, and there is a kind of fun to thinking of it that way. And yet at the same time, the reasons that things concentrate or are, the ways in which they are certain places, like, in Florida, they're at Universal Studios, that, they do say something about Florida or they do say something about LA. So there is a lot that they're not all the same, and it's not just a set of dominoes. I mean, they really do they have some sort of flavor that gets sort of, they brine in. Did you want to talk about off-screen voices, Pacho?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, part of part of putting this film together was so we shot the whole film in 16 millimeter. And so the whole film has this sort of late 19th century feel to it, to the images and just the
20th.
textures of the film.
20th century.
Late 20th century, sorry. Yeah. Late 20th century feel, yes. Really, it felt like the Victorian era. No, but so it sort of had this late 20th century feel to the images that was important to us, so sort of both a kind of, nostalgia and the sense of sort of living history, maybe. And part of that too is just sort of thinking about the ways in which filmmaking, that when done with film, is different than filmmaking when done with video, right? Like what are some of the choices that you have to make when you're doing one but not the other? It wasn't really possible for us to film lengthy interviews with every person we encountered. It would have been sort of financially prohibitive. And so that's definitely something that was on our minds, but also the decision to kind of embrace that limitation and think about how else we could use these voices and the other kinds of contrasts that we could build into the film by putting them against architectural shots or environmental shots. And in building a film, one thing I think about a lot in terms of powering the film, or what gives a film its motor, is what are the kinds of contrasts inside the film? What are the oppositions? It's not quite drama, but it's that same sort of idea that there's some kind of conflict or disjuncture inside the film that energizes it. In this case, I think having these voices up against images of the landscape and images of the environment, and sort of thinking about the voices as emanating not from an individual so much as from a context, and thinking about that as a kind of just as a kind of structuring principle, right? Like that you weren't going to get individual characters all the time, but sometimes we would start to sort of put these voices up against just the context from which they were emerging. Some of it was also the sort of the growth of our interest over time. I think as we filmed more and more, we started to be more interested in sort of using landscape and voice one against the other, and really doing sort of interviews. Some of the interviews went on for like 2 or 3 hours. And so these people who get 90 seconds in the movie, you know, we really had a deep reservoir of their interview to pick just the right turn of phrase from.
Well, I mean, I definitely see this as coming from the practice of, you know, the limited reels, like the film that you would have. But there's still a disjuncture, right, between, you know, sometimes we see like the man fishing, for instance, in Kansas, and the 2 college students at the University of Virginia, and sometimes we see people in the frame, but it's, you know, not clear if the person that we are hearing is talking about the people in the frame or is part of the group of people within the frame. And so to me, conceptually, this is like the strength of the film, actually, right? Because you can see and it's introduced, like the first person talking about one of these slabs is the State Department tour guide, who's talking about, you know, like these are the signatures, the marks that are left on the wall. So it's, you know, about reading something visually into like the visual evidence of the leftovers of the monuments themselves. So then to me, like when the images are being withheld, that's doing something quite radical and destabilizing like the evidentiary relationship of what we're seeing to what we're hearing. Because I think so often, like what's going on in documentary these days, right, is actually this, like you don't actually watch in verite films anymore people saying what they're saying. It's like, you know, what they're saying is used as voiceover scaffolding to like glue together a scene. And then this to me is like deliberately destabilizing what would be like a very one-to-one relationship.
Sure, absolutely. And I guess the way that I think I'm saying the same thing, but just putting it in my own language. I'd say that a lot of American documentary overemphasizes sort of the psychological, or overemphasizes, the psychological sort of origin of language, right? People are speaking because of their past experiences, and their past experiences have shaped the words that come out of their mouth. In a sort of individual, personal way. It's their individual experiences that have created that language. And there's another way to think about language, which is in terms of a social context, right? That you're speaking the things that you're saying because of the society that you're emerging from, because of the built environment that you're emerging from, because of the social bonds that you're emerging from. And so language has this other kind of social, political dimension to it as well. I think that gets de-emphasized in a lot of American documentaries. You know, you'll learn so much about a particular character's childhood, but it won't be presented in sort of class terms or sort of social dynamic terms. And I think that's something that we're interested in this film, is sort of putting these voices up against the kind of, or trying to position them socially and position them politically vis-a-vis the physical space that they're emerging from. I also think about crumbling a lot. That's the kind of, as we were editing, more than when we were shooting, but when we were editing, that was definitely a sort of a principle to the design of the film, that it starts in a way that feels more structured and deliberate, and as the film goes, it sort of kind of begins to unravel a little bit or collapse, crumble perhaps, and that the film has, again, these are like horrible terms, but like the film, to the extent that it has like an A story and a B story, the A story is me and Courtney visiting all these sites around the US. And the B story is it does sort of walk you a little bit through the history of the Berlin Wall, starting with sort of, you get a little bit of Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. The midpoint of the film, of course, is the collapse of the wall itself. And then yeah, and just in that way, and then at the end you get sort of a little bit of escape footage from the late 80s. So it just, the film has a little bit of a historical timeline built into it as well.
Yeah, I did want to ask about those archival sequences because they stand out materially and textually a lot in the film. And the last escape sequence, it appears to be the video that has been described earlier in the film too by one of the interviewees. So you just talked about how, you know, these three sequences kind of establish a broader historical arc too, but amid everything else, which is so clearly your footage, I mean, was that, where's the video from? Like, what was so resonant about them outside of generating this arc? Like, what was it in contrasting them with the present day footage for you?
Yeah, I mean, we thought a lot about archival placement here. I mean, I think like one thing I'm hearing both of you say that is, you know, there's language as personal character building, and there's language as claims, you know, and I think that one of the things that we had on our hands was a film with like a main character that is a slab of concrete, you know, in repetition. And so, you know, I think, you know, how do you voice that? How do you let that thing not speak, you know, but like complicate itself? I mean, how do you let that character develop, you know, if that's the character? And so we felt that, you know, there is this kind of ricochet, you know, things bouncing off the wall, you know, that are human voices and claims. And so, I think the archival is also part of that. It's part of a set of sort of institutional voices that make certain claims on the wall's behalf. And I think, you know, I know there's this question in the chat also about kind of how the film, how we changed over the process, you know, through the process of this and how the film changed. And I think one big thing during editing, you know, the scope of what we were doing was, we weren't sure, you know, it's like, do we need to explicate, you know, the entire story of the Cold War? I mean, we had cuts of this film with segments from the Olympics and chess and Fisher Spassky and, you know, so many historical moments that felt significant to telling the story of East and West. And at some point we had to kind of pare it down and, you know, really think about what discourses we were interested in formally. And so we ended up kind of honoring pieces of archival that were situated like in situ with the wall, you know, or had been given to us, you know, by the home movie that, you know, somebody gives us that was their trip with their family to the wall as a tourist. So we were sort of, I think we began to see ourselves both in editing, but also in the process of making the film as receivers. You know, we were sort of receiving and listening, and you know, if it was given to us, we, you know, just put it in our scrapbook, you know, and the film at some level, you know, feels like a kind of scrapbook of all of those encounters, even when it is media.
And also, I think in our framing and sort of positioning of all the archival, it was very important to us that you understand that it's not our archival per se, but you understand that it's it's being presented by a specific location in the film, and then you're able to sort of speculate on why that particular location has chosen to privilege that piece of archival. So obviously the American Military Museum, who's sort of so vested in the initial building of the wall, and the JFK Museum that's so invested in, JFK's speech at the wall. The News Museum that's so invested in the ways that Tom Brokaw sort of, explained this monumental event to the larger world when the wall fell in '89, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The archival was very much, situated or positioned, and that's something that you don't get in many, I think in many archival films. You never asked, or you never have the thought, why do I have this image and not another image? Why is this the one that made it down through history to the present day? And that's hopefully something that is kind of asked by the way that we're using archival in this film.
That's true. It's about the provenance,
Mhm.
of the archival itself. So as Courtney mentioned, we are taking questions from the audience. I have been remiss in not mentioning that until this point. If you have a question, please just, if you're in the Zoom webinar, put it into the chat box. If you're on Facebook, just make a comment and we will get to it. Absolutely. Well, did you want to, Courtney or Pacho, did you want to add anything else to Ezra's question, which was, when it takes 4 years to make a film, a lot can change. Can you speak a bit about how the story and themes emerged in real time over those years?
Sure, yeah, in many ways. And I think, especially while we were shooting and gathering, many things were happening in the political landscape of America that were shifting the way people, what people talked about, and Confederate monuments were really on people's minds for a period of time, or, continuously, but, really in the news, and in the news cycle for a period of time. Trump's wall would dominate and then recede as a thing that was, very much on people's minds when we started. And then, other things were kind of taking precedence. So Russia, the idea of Russia was circulating in different ways. So, so we were like catching, we were catching a lot of real time, just in terms of what people were saying. But I think for us, it was a lot of kind of, creative growth in a way of just kind of letting the process, it sounds so corny, like teach us, what it wanted to do. And I think we came into this thinking, okay, we're going to do this essay film, we're going to film all these pieces of wall, then we're going to say every smart thing that we can think of about it. We really thought that was going to be the structure of this film. And I was doing sound recording, and a lot of, I think it was the second location I was on was Monterey. This it's not in the final film, but the person who was just our minder, who's showing us around, was just interesting, and the conversation, I was just doing environmental sound, but he had lots of comments about this military school that we were at, and it began to dawn on us that there was just the limits of our own imagination and our own intellects even could never match the kind of like real, grain of America in the ways that we were encountering it in these like unexpected ways. And so I think getting out of the way was something that changed for us. And I think I think personally it was good,
It's just so nice to have the time to make a film. I mean, it's such a luxury. We're not making any money off this. In fact, we've lost a fair bit. But just we're thankfully in a position that we can do this. And just having the space to really like turn over the ideas and edit the material as much as we needed to, or as much as we wanted to, was really, I think hopefully adds to the depth of the film. I feel like a lot of work gets rushed for one reason or another, and this certainly was not rushed.
Yeah. So there is, I mean, on this question of time and working together, there is a question from Facebook. So appreciate this film, for exclamation points. I'd love to hear about the choice of working together and what you each bring / share with one another and what disagreements you had along the way. And I'm actually quite interested to hearing the answer to this from Pacho, because you have collaborated with quite a few people in your career from beginning to end. Yeah.
Yeah,
But of course, to both of you.
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
I mean, I can just say, like, in general terms, it's much nicer to work with people. There are people who make films all alone, but I think those people are few and far between. Most shoots, you have a camera person and a sound person. It's just there's a natural like dualism to shooting documentaries. And you know, to sort of treat those relationships as equal and mutual seems to me like I mean, it makes sense both on like an ethical, political level, and it just makes me more sort of I feel like I'm more comfortably acknowledging like what's actually going on a film shoot at the end of the day, like and how decisions are actually getting made in most film production scenarios.
Yeah, and
that said, like we did have a number of fights also. Yeah.
I mean, I guess
there's more like
I could reframe that last part of the question too, to like,
sure.
you know, how did you decide on like what was the decision-making process as a co-directed film when you did have disagreements, and if you had to put a finger on it, like what did resolving those disagreements do to improve the film, if they did, you know?
We still disagree about certain things, but no, I mean, you know, we fought it out. I think we fought it out. I mean, I think ultimately, you know, we are interested in each other's minds, and so it was, you know, still felt nutritive, you know, even when it was bad. But we, you know, we also had an editor who we were working with, Junia Sichov, who's in France, and it was useful to have other parties. We also worked with Hannah Buck, who came on to do some consulting editing at the end. We also did our final kind of picture lock and our sound mixing over at the Wexner Center, and the folks there were helpful and some tie breaking. So we did have some referees, but
yeah, and just having voices, right? Like I mean, for some people it works very well to be in their own head and just sort of be in dialogue with themselves and sort of working through the creative issues that way. But I think it's actually kind of the same thing to just like voice it back and forth. You know, it's like either the voices are going on in your brain and arguing with each other, or you're doing it with a partner. And it's nice, especially when you're doing something that is a really sort of is a long kind of like epic effort. I mean, epic is a strong word, but this is certainly like the most travel I've ever done for a film, the most, you know, the most expense, the most there's a lot of it was a big film, you know. We visited probably 30 states during production. And so having somebody to sort of share that, having
I mean, we got to travel a lot and eat at a lot of strange eateries, and you know, it was all very we weren't meandering. We were on a tight budget, so it was like we would cover sometimes at 500 miles a day. You know, it was not sightseeing, but but yeah, it was fun to be on an adventure with somebody.
And we actually only premiered it about 2 weeks before the pandemic hit. And I'm just trying to imagine, like, if we hadn't had the film done, if we'd had to wait all this time, you know, yeah, it would have been unfortunate.
Yeah. Some things, serendipity helps out with some films, like yours getting the in-person premiere in Berlin, of course.
Yeah.
So I mean, also the statement about the road trip, honestly, when I was watching this, I was reminded of because I grew up in the Midwest, and there's a whole bunch of like Americana, like world's biggest dinosaur, and it's a concrete statue of a dinosaur, and world's biggest peach, and it's a concrete statue of a peach, or world's biggest baseball hat. And those are the things that dotted like my childhood imagination as my family would go on road trips for summer vacations from the middle of the country. We'd drive everywhere instead of flying to places. So seeing these concrete slabs rise out of the background of your film actually took me very much back to a outdoors on the road mindset in a nice way.
We were fairly interested in that stuff. We actually shot, but again, didn't make it in the film, at Carhenge, which is a Stonehenge entirely of old cars. And then we even went back there and shot more because we were so intrigued by it. But yeah, I mean, we were thinking about the roadside attraction element of this.
Yes. Oh, that's another thing. Like every Midwestern town has their own blank henge. Like the city where I grew up had Boathenge, for instance, right by the Missouri River.
I've been reading about Boathenge. Yeah, that's another sort of like fantasy project, is covering all the henges.
Yeah.
In the,
you could make a series of
US.
spin-offs of the American sector following weird things that Americans have erected in their backyards over time. So I would like to ask Courtney a direct question at this point, talking about, traveling together, because for those who are listening who don't know, the Female Travelogue is a special interest of Courtney's from Terra Femme live performance piece that I've seen you give at Open City Documentary Festival, a project that I think you've been working on for many years at this point, or at least working with that collection of home videos made by women travelers for many years. I'm curious how, and you do other traveling yourself for your projects and for, how did this fit in with that? And I'm asking because although we hear Pacho sometimes in the American sector, it's really your voice that I think we hear most often, and that I think at some points really guides the interviewees into examining deeper their conceptions about the places that they're in, things like that. Do you consider like the American sector, because I've been calling it a road trip documentary, and so have other people. Do you consider this a road trip project or film at all? Where does it sit in with your other research?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, it's interesting. It's somehow hard for me to separate the final film from the process of making it. So of course, for me, it does feel like a highly mobile project, particularly from the perspective of now in the last year. But I mean, I sort of want to give a conceptual answer about the film, but I do think that a lot of these projects, even, yeah, I've been sort of working for the last 5 years with a number of different archives that collect amateur films made by women in the 1930s through the 50s mostly. And I do think that I am interested in mobility, but I think a lot of these questions also have to do about, like, the questions of movement also have to do with, tides of history, and the way that people are inadvertently caught in those tides. So I think, in a sense, even though there is a traveling element to this, I do think that I think maybe what unites this piece to other work I've done is really thinking about kind of the small actor, against kind of mass historical movements and events. So I am kind of interested in that sort of dialectical situation. And I think, talking to people in this film, it's not like, it's like what I do. I'm a little chatty. So I don't, I do think that it ended up being useful, when we went to edit, having some conversations that had lots of digression and did kind of meander into friendly territory and connecting with people. And though I think, in a sense, I was also doing sound. So, I was the one with a microphone. So I'm on those recordings, but what's I gonna say? I do think, one of the great benefits to what we were up to politically in a way is that we could talk about the Berlin Wall and it somehow was not a charged subject. It just, there were, it was like we were able to kind of reach across a lot of, I think, implied political lines between us and people we encountered, or, difference, it just wasn't charged with the thing that something in the contemporary moment would be. I mean, even something like 9/11 or, something in more recent history, enough time had passed that there was a strange flattening of it to a set of, media, spectacle, all these sorts of, communism, capitalism, like it had distilled into a certain set of slightly rigid things that are kind of, I don't know, that are at play in the American imagination at this point. And so in a way, it allowed for conversation that didn't get defensive and didn't, we were talking about something, but through another thing, it was very displaced. And I think that mode is one that I enjoy. So yeah, there's a lot of chatting. I don't know if I'm answering your question about travel, but.
Well, I mean, it strikes me that, the film is obviously about mobility. Like several people in the film point out, the sections of the Berlin Wall have been moved to the US. And then the people who are immigrants or come from an immigrant background are also ruminating on the mobility of human bodies and borders that are physical or not. But it does strike me as that the embodiment of the two of you as filmmakers that are also moving around and being a constant and the force of these encounters. Like for instance, I think about the crane operator, I believe, or the person who's talking about the crane operation. And his political beliefs were something that did surprise me and how that was framed. And I do think that there's something about like forcing those types of encounters that resonates. I don't know. I don't want to say in a feminine way or I just said it though, or anything like that. But there's a gentleness in the way that both of you are asking these questions that I think enfolds everything. I think that the subjects are projecting back onto you the energy that you have given them as well.
Thanks, that's a huge compliment. I think that was our intention. I think that like part of it is that, and this goes back to this question of learning and that in the process of doing something is that we may have had answers ourselves going into this of what is the Berlin Wall doing in America, and I think that actually those answers or assumptions that we had started to unravel, which actually allowed the film to gain more spaciousness in terms of our process and what we were talking about with people. I mean, I think that there were definitely encounters that I went into hoping somebody would say the very soundbite that I, thought that, should be articulated somehow. And that really dissipated over time. We were just meeting, truly unusual people and circumstances and encountering those and just interesting, the guy who bought his slab of the wall at a, at an auction because some individual who had defrauded many others, it was being sold as part of his estate. I mean, these, like, you can't make it up sort of stuff, so eventually like nonfiction took over.
Yeah, so, the adage, truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
Well, we are coming on to the end of our time. So I'd just like to give you both the floor to tell us what you're working on now, if you have anything to share, any news of new films that have been released, for instance.
Me? You?
Or-
I'm still working with these travelogues, and then there's going to be another online event hosting that, which I can't announce, but will happen soon.
And I have a new film called Searchers, which played at Sundance this year about 2 weeks ago, and will hopefully be coming to the DocYard 2022. So.
Looking forward to it. Well, thank you, everyone. When we leave, it will be quite an abrupt ending because it is virtual space. And so we will all just disappear into the void of Zoom. So before that happens, thank you so much, Courtney and Pacho, for joining us, for returning to the DocYard to share your film with all of us. And also for those who have a DocYard pass or who don't, our next screening is Drido Hamadi's Downstream to Kinshasa. Icarus Films has so generously allowed us to do a special sneak preview of this film also before its virtual cinema release. This film premiered at TIFF after it was supposed to play at Cannes 2020 in person. As we all know, that never happened. And I think this is a masterpiece of a film. So please join us for that in 2 weeks. All right.
Thank you, Abby.
Bye,
Thanks so much.
everyone. And again,
Thanks to
I'm
the DocYard.
sorry, we're just going to be booted off in a second.
Totally fine.